Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book that I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. Um, so you can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or the Bible Baptist Bookstore. You may not agree with my conclusions I draw from world history as a Bible believer, but you, no matter what you believe, should at least know about the things that I'm discussing. Um, so it looks like the sun's going to be coming in here. So if you'll bear with me a moment, I'm going to put something up in front of my window to, although I love the sunshine coming in, I do not, it is kind of annoying when I get started late and it kind of like, you know, blots you, you're out. Not that you want to look at me, but I like talking about history. And we're going to talk about some things on this side of the Atlantic today. Things are very exciting, very interesting. And if you'll just pay attention to me, I'll get started here. Um, now, there were two important societies in South America in the late part of the first millennium after Christ. Excuse me. I'm having a real hard time today getting started. Sorry about that. They were the Wari and the Tiwanaku, probably the greatest of the forerunners of the Incas. You've heard of the Incas, I know. These cultures were both the descendants of the Norte Chico culture. I'm going to read you a news story from National Public Radio about 20 years ago. Uh, Christopher Joyce wrote, Ancient Complex Peruvian Communities Explored. This is from All Things Considered on December 22nd, 2004. Along the coast of central Peru, a remarkable sight is emerging from underneath the desert sand. Archaeologists have found the ruins of some 20 communities clustered along 3 rivers. Some date back 5,000 years. People there grew crops and built huge stone monuments that predate the Egyptian pyramids. As NPR's Christopher Joyce reported, it is believed to be the oldest complex culture in the Americas. The region where the ancient sites are located is bone dry, except for the land that lies along the river valleys that run down to the Pacific coast. There, archaeologists found mounds of earth inside were terraced stone platforms, some 80 feet high. That's 8 stories. Archaeologist Jonathan Haas of Chicago's Field Museum says the region's climate dried up about 3,000 years ago. That drove hunters and gatherers to the coast where they settled and began to fish. As Haas and his colleagues report in the current issue of the journal Nature, they also built villages inland along the rivers and grew vegetables and cotton. Trade followed along with the monumental buildings and other trappings of urban life. Not in the news story, just want to remind you, remember the earth is drying out after the flood. So you're going to see a lot of this happen. Areas drying out, driving hunters, people who have been dispersed, whose ancestors were dispersed, and now they're going to go find water sources. There were other places in the Americas with signs of settlement and agriculture as old as those in the Norte Chico region of Peru, but none was as complex as anthropologist and Peru expert Dan Sandweiss of the University of Maine. Haas says it's not clear that why these communities died out and what influence they might have had on the Nazca and Inca cultures that followed. Again, I quote Haas in the article, I've been doing archaeology for more than 35 years, and I've been stunned by the archaeology we're running into, Haas says. It's like somebody has granted me my very best wish. Now, an earlier news article, unquote, an earlier news article from the Smithsonian magazine about the work of a Peruvian archaeologist who claims that the one mentioned above that I just mentioned committed gross plagiarism in copying her work is interesting. A Dr. Shady has claimed her work was copied by the above mentioned scholar. Now, leaving Dr. Shady's claims of plagiarism aside, which you can read on the internet if you like, I'm going to move on. Let's talk about these cultures. Excuse me. The Wari and the Tiwanaku worshiped the same gods and lived in networks of trade and barter and had similar architecture. In other ways, they were very different. Their geography was that of modern-day Peru. Wari was the more centralized of the two, east of Lima and high in the Andes Mountains. It first rose to prominence during the 6th century. While other less sophisticated cultures, for which we have less evidence, were being decimated by the long drought and then El Nino-type floods and were disintegrating, the Wari were beginning to thrive. One clue as to its success may have been its method of agriculture, with extensive terracing of steep mountains and irrigation to complement. Peru has more farmable, which is called arable, land above 9,000 feet than below for some odd reason, probably having to do with the uplift of useful land after the Great Flood when the Andes were formed. By diverting snowmelt from the ice caps high in the mountains to their high farm terraces, they were literally able to rise above the Great Drought and subsequent flooding that crippled the lowlanders. The main crop in the highlands was the potato, which, unlike maize, a cereal grain we in the United States call corn, grows at altitudes of 14,000 feet. Now, when they mention corn in the Bible, they're talking about a corn of wheat. So in British English, corn can refer to the head of any cereal grain. So notably wheat. So it'll say that in the Bible, a corn of wheat. So when it says corn, they're not saying that they're eating ears of corn in the Bible. Okay, they're talking about wheat. So let's get back to the story. The potato, cultivated in hundreds of varieties, can be left in the ground for as long as a year if the weather remains cold to be dug up and cooked when needed. Maize, though, was the popular food and what people wanted, as it was the preference of the elite and the base from which chicha, a potent alcoholic drink, was made. And because terraces soaked up more sunlight in high altitudes than the steep slopes, maize was able to be grown at higher altitudes than usual as well. This was the Wari genius. Using their advanced farming methods as a tool for cultural and political influence, they brought vast amounts of their neighbors into their sphere, controlling a 1,000-mile long swath of the Peruvian Andes. One sign of their influence was the spread of their religion, in which something called staff god was most important. The staff was transformed into a stalk of maize and was worshipped. Wari farming techniques had reclaimed more than 1 million acres of cropland from mountainsides than anywhere else would have been considered too dry, steep, and cold for agriculture. Today, most of the terraces are abandoned, but to the Spanish who conquered the region, the mountains appeared to be covered by flights of stairs, in the words of one Jesuit priest. Wari's capital city, also named Wari, existed on a mountain plateau near the modern city of Ayacucho. Beginning in the first centuries AD, the city ultimately spread across 2 square miles with 2 and 3 story buildings and compounds separated by massive walls. Peasant homes and palaces were built in a similar style. Everything was enclosed behind high white walls with no standout public buildings or great open spaces, just a thick mass of walls and narrow streets covered in garbage. It appears that the walls were intended for privacy, not protection, as Wari would have been a hard place to defend. Along the spine of the Andes, the empire set up a string of 12 or so administrative centers that were miniature versions of the capital. There is little record of Wari warfare, as its supremacy was most certainly commercial and intellectual. Wari emissaries eventually moved into an area between Lake Titicaca and the coast of the Pacific Ocean called Cerro Baul. Today, this area is regarded as an apu, or an ancient spirit transformed into a rock. This was a difficult place to live, as it is a 500-yard long mesa with no water. To bring water in, the Wari carved a 15-mile canal through the mountains and then had a long line of servants passing up full containers of water hand to hand to serve the priests and princes above. Once the empties were sent back down, they were refilled and back up they went. About 750 AD, archaeologists tell us, after the Wari had been at Cerro Baul for 100 years, Tiwanaku from the region of the lake moved into the area. Anthropologists, or those who study human cultures and history, report that Tiwanaku City, which is the capital of their culture, was located at the south end of Lake Titicaca. At 12,000, I know that's a very funny sounding name, but that's the name. At 12,600 feet, it was the highest city in the Americas and possibly the world. Tiwanaku dominated the many small cities around it, not by military conquest, but by its religious power. People in the region ascribed much supernatural power to its priests, and its state religion served as the function of a mighty army, but at much less cost. The mnemonic power that the spirit world holds over many non Christian cultures is extraordinary, and Christian cultures, with fear and wonder being the main expression of religious belief. Local rulers subordinated themselves to obtain supernatural favor. The city of Tiwanaku underscored the awe and power the culture invoked over its people. Ruling over the skyline of the city was a seven-tiered pyramid, Akapana, laid out in a pattern similar to what is known as the Andean cross. This is a step shape that some claim is inspired by the Southern Cross constellation and represents the four quarters of the world. So massive were its stone pillars that the first European to see the city, Pedro Cieza de Leon, said that he could not even begin to understand the kind of tools that would have been used to create such a monument. Acapana rose from the center of a large moat and imitated the look of the surrounding mountains. A precisely engineered and very sophisticated water system at the summit had water cascading down the sides of the monument like a mountain waterfall. Nearby was a smaller structure, a large walled enclosure called Kalasasaya, or the Gateway of the Sun, cut from the single block of stone. Unlike other ancient cities, this one, according to some archaeologists, was even at its height, partially in ruins and incomplete, left that way to impart some type of ancient authority and credibility to its splendor. One Spanish scholar noted in the 16th century that these people built their monuments as if it was never their intent to finish them, but to always be in process. Scholars tell us that completion was not the object, but constant purposeful activity was the object. Unlike Western cities, Tiwanaku had no market. Andean societies were based on exchange of goods and services through the power of their family groups and government control, not market forces, which is why you don't see many marketplaces in these ancient cities. Citizens grew their food and made their own clothes, had them handed down through their family or kinship association, or picked them up from government warehouses. The city's purpose was concentrating the political and religious authority of the elite. Tiwanaku carried this idea to an extreme. Archaeologists who study the physical remains of the past and anthropologists who study human cultures in the past and present have called Tiwanaku a combination between the Vatican and Disneyland, a religious capital designed for show with a small population, or as one source said, a staff to work the pilgrims it attracted, which must have numbered in the thousands. The encounter between the Wari and the Tiwanaku at Cerro Bayo must have went smoothly because excavation of nearly 1,000 graves have shown no evidence of large-scale violence. They lived together peacefully, but paradoxically, in different neighborhoods, and they cooperated in the provision of the essential water supply. They kept themselves culturally distinct and seem to have kept social contact to a minimum. The Wari finally abandoned Cerro Bayul in about 800 AD, symbolically burning their homes and smashing their pottery, soon to be followed by the Tiwanaku. The reason may have been another extended period of drought. Another great empire, the Timor, followed soon after, extending its hegemony over 700 miles of Peruvian coastline. Its strength was growing maize and cotton by irrigating some 50,000 acres around the Moche River, an agricultural feat not imitated again until 1960. In about 1100 AD, another weather-inspired catastrophe made irrigation impossible for a time, so government forced gangs of captive labor built a 53-mile masonry-lined canal to channel water from the Chicama River in the next valley north. The canal was a failure, and some archaeologists suggest it was meant to be a PR stunt to show people that the government was really making an effort to combat the drought. When the drought was over, Timor decided to expand and left its capital, Chan Chan, a city reserved only for the elite. The three-story palaces, 100 feet on each side, were barred to commoners except for a few artisans and craftsmen. Chan Chan was short on usable buildings because dead rulers were viewed as divine figures, and their mummified bodies continued to, quote, live large in their own homes that could not be displaced. They were even invited to important state occasions. Each new ruler had to build his own palace and provide his own riches as the dead rulers kept theirs. This kept the rulers ambitious with new building projects. The largest Chan Chan palace is thought to have belonged to Michoacaman, the 11th king of the Timor dynasty, who, according to one Spanish account, conquered a large swatch of coastline. He would have been even more successful, probably, if he had lived at the time of the emergence of another group's newly acquired ruler, more powerful and more ambitious, but drawing a lot of, you'll find out, drawing a lot of the practices of the older dynasty. I'm talking about, speaking of the Incas, Pachacuti, and we're going to talk about the Incas next, a little bit. And I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did. I love talking about and studying South America, North America, Asia, the Polynesia, just all the things that you just don't get talked about in high school. It's always Rome and Greece, which is great. I love Rome and Greece, very foundations of Western civilization. But there were other civilizations out there. There were other things happening in the world besides what's going on in Europe. So you need to know about this stuff, at least be aware of it so you're not ignorant. Okay. I enjoyed, I learned a lot. I mean, when I first started doing this world history thing for homeschoolers, I was so disgusted with the literature available to me. It was so narrow. And so I just opened up a bunch of books and I said, let's explore the world. And I hope you're enjoying this because I am.